This episode discusses the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of a young woman. While the story is told with respect and without sensationalism, the details are confronting. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Coffee and Crime AU. Tonight's case is one of the most notorious crimes in Australian history. A case that shocked the country. A case that changed the way that Australians thought about violent crime, about sentencing, and about justice. In February 1986, a 26-year-old nurse finished work in Sydney. She caught the train home to the western suburbs and began the short walk home to her parents' house. She never made it. Within hours, she would become the victim of one of the most brutal and senseless murders Australia has ever seen. Her name was Anita Cobby. But before Anita became a headline, before she became a symbol of public outrage, and before her death changed the law, she was simply a daughter, a nurse, a wife, and a woman with plans for the future. Tonight we're going to tell Anita's story from the beginning, because to understand the horror of what happened that night, we first have to understand who Anita was. Sydney, November 2nd, 1959. Anita Lorraine Lynch was born into a working-class family in Sydney's western suburbs. Her father, Gary Lynch, was a graphic artist who worked with the Royal Australian Air Force. Her mother, Grace Lynch, also known as Peggy, was a nurse. It was a close-knit family, hard-working and supportive, and by all accounts, Anita grew up surrounded by love. Friends described her as bright, fun, energetic, and incredibly kind. She had a warm personality that made people feel comfortable almost instantly. Teachers remembered her as confident. Her family remembered her as fiercely loyal. She also stood out for another reason. Anita was strikingly beautiful, the kind of beauty that turns heads the moment she entered a room. And as she grew older, that beauty opened doors. In the late 1970s, beauty pageants were hugely popular across Australia. Local competitions were held across suburbs and regional towns. And in November 1979, Anita had entered the Miss Western Suburbs pageant. To no one's surprise, she won. Becoming Miss Western Suburbs suddenly placed Anita in the spotlight. She began receiving modelling offers, and there was real potential for a career in modelling. Many people expected that she would pursue it, but Anita had different plans. Despite the glamour and opportunities, she chose a very different path, a path inspired by her mother. Anita wanted to become a nurse. Nursing was demanding work, long shifts, emotionally draining, and often underpaid. But Anita approached it with the same warmth that she showed in every other part of her life. She trained at Sydney Hospital, one of the oldest hospitals in Australia, and colleagues later described her as exactly the kind of nurse you would want caring for you. She was gentle, patient, and deeply compassionate. Patients trusted her, doctors respected her, and fellow nurses loved working with her. One colleague said Anita had a natural ability to comfort people in their worst moments. She could make people laugh and bring warmth into rooms that were otherwise filled with fear. For Anita, nursing wasn't just a job. It was a calling. While studying nursing, Anita met a young man named John Cobby. They met through friends while she was training at Sydney Hospital, and their relationship developed quickly. John was drawn to Anita's warmth and personality, and Anita enjoyed his company. Within a few years, they were engaged, and on the 27th of March 1982, Anita Lynch married John Cobby. From that moment forward, she became Anita Cobby. The couple began building a life together, but like many young marriages, things don't always go smoothly. By 1986, Anita and John were experiencing difficulties. The relationship had become strained. Arguments had become more common. And eventually, the couple decided to separate. Anita moved back into her parents' home in Blacktown in Sydney's western suburbs. But despite the separation, the relationship between Anita and John was not hostile. In fact, according to John, the two remained on good terms. Friends and family said there were even discussions about possibly reconciling. Life was still moving forward. Anita was continuing her work as a nurse. She was spending time with friends. She was rebuilding her independence. And for her family, having her back home was something they cherished. They enjoyed having their daughter close again. Blacktown in the mid-1980s was a rapid-growing working-class suburb, full of commuters travelling to the city each day. Anita was one of those commuters. Every morning she would travel from Blacktown into Sydney for work at the hospital. Then in the evening she would take the train home. It was routine, predictable, safe. Or at least that's what everyone believed. Usually when Anita arrived back at Blacktown railway station, she would call her father. He would drive down and pick her up. It was a simple system, and it meant Anita didn't have to walk the distance home alone at night. But on the night of February 2nd, 1986, that routine changed. And that small change would have devastating consequences. February 2nd, 1986 was a Sunday. Anita had finished work earlier in the day at Sydney Hospital. Her shift ended around 3 p.m, and instead of heading straight home, she decided to meet friends for dinner. They gathered in Redfern, not far from the hospital. It was a relaxed evening, food, conversation, nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest that within hours Anita's life would be brutally taken. Later that evening, Anita said goodbye to her friends and made her way to Central Railway Station. From there, she boarded the train, heading back to Blacktown. The train departed around 9:12 p.m. Passengers sat quietly, some reading, some staring out of the window, some simply tired after the weekend. For Anita, it was just another trip home. But someone else was already moving through the western suburbs that night. A group of men, driving a stolen car, looking for trouble. At around 10 p.m, Anita stepped off the train at Blacktown station. It was late, but not unusually late for someone commuting from the city. She walked toward the public telephone, because normally this is where she would call her father. But that night the phone wasn't working. And when she looked toward the taxi rank, there were no taxis waiting. So Anita made a decision that thousands of commuters made every day. She decided to walk home. It was only a short distance and the path that she knew well. Along Newton Road, and then toward the quiet suburban streets near her parents' house. It should have been an uneventful walk. 10 minutes, maybe 15. But Anita never reached home. Because as she walked along Newton Road, a car approached. And inside were 5 men, watching her. Moments later, the car stopped beside her. 2 of the men jumped out, and the quiet suburban street exploded with screams. That moment would mark the beginning of one of the most horrific crimes in Australian history. But at that moment, no one yet understood what was happening, except for a small group of witnesses who heard something no one should ever have to hear. A woman screaming for help in the dark. In that car were 5 men who had spent much of their lives committing crimes across Sydney's western suburbs. That night they had been drinking, smoking marijuana, and had been driving around for hours, stealing petrol, looking for opportunities and looking for trouble. When they saw Anita walking home alone, they stopped. The car the men were driving was a stolen HT Holden Kingswood. It had been taken earlier and was being used as what police would later describe as a crime vehicle. The men inside had already accumulated dozens of criminal convictions between them: assault, robbery, car theft, burglary, and violence. They were not strangers to crime, but what they were about to do would shock even experienced detectives. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but for people who heard it, it felt much longer. Anita began screaming, loud, desperate, terrified. Across the road inside a nearby house, a family heard the screams. A 16-year-old boy, his younger sister, and their mother rushed outside. And when they did, they saw something horrifying. They saw Anita struggling. 2 men were forcing her toward the car. She fought back, kicking, screaming, desperately trying to escape. The boy ran across the road to help, but the attackers were faster. They forced Anita into the car. The door slammed shut, and the car sped away. By the time the boy reached the street, the car was already disappearing into the darkness. Shaken, the boy ran back inside the house and immediately called police. He told them what he had seen: a woman screaming, men forcing her into a car, a Holden. But at that moment, no one yet understood the scale of what had just happened. It sounded like an abduction, possibly a robbery, maybe even a domestic dispute. But the truth was far worse. Within minutes of the car leaving Newton Road, it's believed the boy's brother returned home. He had been out with his girlfriend. When he heard what had happened, he immediately got back into his car and began searching the surrounding streets. That decision would bring him dangerously close to the killers, closer than he could possibly imagine. Driving through the nearby streets, he began scanning for the Holden. Eventually, he turned down a quiet rural road near Prospect. At that time, it was known as Reen Road. It was dark, isolated, and surrounded by farmland. As the man drove down the road, something caught his attention. A car parked nearby, a Holden. It matched the description, so he stopped. And using a spotlight from his car, he began scanning the nearby paddock, looking for movement, looking for someone who might need help. But he saw nothing. The grass was long, the field was quiet. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of Anita. Believing the car might not actually be the one he was looking for, he eventually left. What he didn't know was how close he had come. Because hidden in the tall grass nearby, the attackers were lying flat on the ground, holding Anita down, waiting silently for the spotlight to move away. Before they reached the paddock, the attackers had already begun raping Anita. Inside the moving car, she was surrounded. 5 men. No way out. According to later confessions and evidence presented in court, Anita begged them to let her go. She told them she was married. She pleaded with them. She tried to appeal to whatever humanity might exist inside the car. At one point, she even told them she was menstruating, hoping it might stop them from raping her, but it didn't. Instead, the attackers began beating her repeatedly, punching her in the face with enough force to break her nose and both of her cheekbones. The violence escalated rapidly. The car continued driving, further away from the suburbs, further away from help, toward the isolated farmland of Prospect. At one point during the drive, the attackers stopped at a petrol station. Using money stolen from Anita's purse, they bought fuel. To the outside world, it looked like a completely ordinary moment. A car stopping to put petrol in. People paying for petrol. Nothing unusual. But inside that car, a woman was being held down, terrified, injured, and completely helpless. Once the car was refueled, the men continued driving back toward the isolated road, toward the paddock where the neighbour had briefly searched. Eventually, the car stopped. The attackers dragged Anita from the car. By this point, she had already been severely beaten and raped multiple times, but the violence didn't stop. The men dragged her across the ground towards a barbed wire fence. The sharp metal tore into her skin as she was pulled through it, leaving deep cuts across her body. The area surrounding Reen Road in 1986 was very different from today. Much of it was farmland, quiet, isolated. Large open paddocks broken up by wire fences and scattered farm buildings. At night, it was completely dark. There were no streetlights, no houses close enough to hear screams, just fields stretching out into the distance. Even in her weakened state, Anita continued to fight. The injuries on her hands and fingers suggested she tried to protect herself. Defensive wounds. The instinctive reaction of someone desperately trying to survive. But the attackers continued their assault. The violence was sustained, systemic, and unbelievably cruel. At some point during the assault, one of the attackers began to panic. That man was John Travers. Travers realised something dangerous. Anita had seen them. She had heard their names while they spoke to each other. If she survived, she could identify them. And for men who already had long criminal records, that meant prison. So Travers argued that Anita couldn't be allowed to live. It was a chilling calculation, cold and utterly devoid of empathy. Eventually, the others agreed and the decision was made. According to court evidence and confessions, Travers took a knife and then he cut Anita's throat. The wound was devastating. The blade severed her windpipe, her ear, and deeply cut into her neck. The injury was so severe it nearly decapitated her. Later testimony from the medical examiner would state that once the wound was inflicted, Anita would have died within approximately 2 minutes. 2 minutes after enduring hours of terror. When the attackers were finished, they left her body in the paddock, abandoned, naked and brutally injured. Then they climbed back into the stolen Holden and drove away, leaving the field in silence. Back in Blacktown, Anita's parents were waiting for her to come home. At first, there was no reason to panic. Sometimes Anita stayed with friends. Sometimes she came home later than expected. But the next morning, she still hadn't returned. And when Anita failed to appear for her shift at the Sydney hospital, alarm bells began ringing. Her family started making calls, friends, colleagues, anyone who might know where she was. No one had seen her since the night before, and slowly, fear began setting in. On February 3rd, 1986, Anita was officially reported missing by her father. But by that point, the worst had already happened. The following morning, February 4th, a farmer in Prospect walked out into one of his paddocks. His cows were behaving strangely. They were gathered together, milling around a particular spot in the grass. Concerned something might be wrong, he walked closer to investigate. And then he saw her. The body of a young woman lying in the grass. Police were called immediately. Detectives arrived at the scene quickly and realised the scale of what they were dealing with. This was not simply a murder, it was an atrocity. The body was severely injured, covered in bruises, cuts, and signs of extreme violence. But there was one detail that allowed investigators to identify her quickly: a distinctive wedding ring. That ring belonged to Anita Cobby. When the news of Anita's murder broke, Australia reacted with shock and then anger. The details emerging from the investigation were absolutely horrifying. This wasn't just a killing. It was an act of extreme cruelty carried out by multiple attackers. Newspapers across the country ran front-page headlines. Television news led with the story, and the public demanded answers. How could something like this happen? How could 5 men commit such a crime? And how could anyone feel safe if this could happen on an ordinary suburban street? Within days, the government of New South Wales announced a reward: $50,000 for information leading to the capture of Anita's killers. At the time, it was a huge amount of money. But even more significant than the reward, the public pressure now building on police, the killers needed to be found, and quickly. Around this time, one moment shocked the nation even further. Popular radio host John Laws obtained a leaked copy of Anita's autopsy report. Instead of summarising it, he read large sections of it live on air. The details were confronting. Many listeners were horrified. But Laws later defended the decision. He believed the public deserved to understand the full brutality of the crime. And in many ways, the broadcast achieved exactly that. It ignited public fury, the kind of anger that would soon lead to political pressure for tougher sentencing laws in Australia. But while the country was reacting, detectives were already closing in on the killers. Because a stolen car, a witness statement, and one crucial police informant were about to unravel the entire crime. The vehicle described by witnesses was quickly identified as a stolen HT Holden Kingswood. The police began tracing reports of similar cars stolen in the western suburbs, and it didn't take long before they found a connection. The car had links to a small group of men already well known to police, men with long criminal records, men who had spent years drifting in and out of prisons across New South Wales. Among them was the man named John Travers. Travers had a reputation for violence. He was known to carry knives, and detectives quickly began looking into his movements on the night Anita disappeared. But investigators didn't yet have enough evidence to make an arrest for murder. They needed something stronger, something that could place these men directly at the crime scene. And that's when an informant came forward. The information came from someone inside the suspect's circle, a woman who knew one of the men personally. She was the partner of Travers' uncle. Police have never publicly revealed her identity. Instead, she became known as simply Miss X. When detectives contacted her, they hoped she might be able to provide insight into Travers' behaviour. But what happened next would prove even more valuable. Because Miss X agreed to help the investigation in a very unusual way. She agreed to wear a hidden recording device. Police arranged for Miss X to visit Travers while he was in custody on unrelated charges. Hidden beneath her clothing was a small recording device, a microphone concealed inside her bra. Her job was simple: talk to Travers, ask questions, and let him speak freely. When she entered the room, Travers had no idea he was being recorded. To him, it was just a conversation with a trusted person. But during that conversation, Travers began talking about the murder. He described what had happened: the car, the group, the assault, and eventually the killing. Everything was captured on tape. The recordings didn't stop there. Miss X also went to visit another suspect, a man named Michael Murdoch. Murdoch was a childhood friend and criminal associate of Travers. Once again, Miss X wore the hidden microphone, and once again the suspect spoke. Murdoch made statements that further confirmed the involvement in the group, statements that placed him at the scene of the crime, statements that corroborated the details detectives were already piecing together. With those recordings, the case against the suspects suddenly became much stronger, and detectives were ready to act. On February 21st, 1986, less than 3 weeks after Anita's murder, police began making arrests. First, they located John Travers. He was in bed with Michael Murphy at the time. They were arrested at the home of Travers' uncle. At around the same time, detectives arrested Les Murphy at Travers' house. The Murphy family would become infamous in the investigation because 3 brothers were involved: Michael Murphy, Gary Murphy, and Les Murphy. 5 men in total. 5 attackers responsible for the abduction, assault, and murder of Anita Cobby. At first, some of the men were only charged with offences relating to stolen cars. But as the investigation continued, the evidence became overwhelming. The taped confessions, the witness accounts, the stolen car, the timeline. Within 22 days of the murder, every suspect had been taken into custody. For detectives, it was a remarkable breakthrough, but for Anita's family, the investigation was only the beginning. Because the next stage would involve a trial that would horrify the entire country. As police examined the backgrounds of the 5 men, they discovered something disturbing. This was not a group of men who had suddenly snapped. They were experienced criminals. Men who had spent years committing violent offences. But nothing in their past records prepared investigators for the sheer brutality of Anita's murder. Investigators were uncovering disturbing details about the 5 men responsible. Details that painted a picture of lives shaped by violence, instability, and crime. At the centre of the group was a man detectives quickly identified as the ringleader, John Travers. John Travers grew up in poverty in the western suburbs of Sydney. He was the eldest of 8 children. His parents were teenagers when he was born, and the family struggled financially. Stability was rare. By the time Travers was a teenager, he was already drinking heavily, and at 14 years old, he had developed a serious alcohol problem. School didn't last long. He was eventually expelled during Year 10 for disruptive behaviour. Teachers described him as aggressive and difficult to control. Without education and with little supervision, Travers drifted deeper into criminal activity. He stole, he fought, and he quickly became known to police. Eventually, his own mother sent him to Boys Town, a juvenile detention centre. But the intervention did little to change his behaviour. Over the years that followed, Travers moved in and out of prison, rarely holding steady employment, often relying on unemployment benefits or criminal activity to survive. Witnesses who later testified about Travers described disturbing behaviour, stories that suggested patterns of cruelty and violence towards animals. One account described him slaughtering livestock in a grotesque and disturbing way. By the mid-1980s, Travers had developed a reputation for violence and for carrying knives. But he wasn't alone. Another key member of the group was Michael Murdoch. Murdoch had known Travers for years. Their friendship developed through shared criminal activity and time spent in juvenile detention centres. Murdoch's childhood was also troubled. He spent significant time in youth detention facilities, and during that time he experienced sexual assaults by other inmates. Years later, letters written by Murdoch to politicians would reveal that he had begged authorities for protection during his incarceration. But those pleas had gone largely unanswered. By adulthood, Murdoch had accumulated a lengthy criminal record. Like Travers, he had spent years drifting between freedom and imprisonment. The remaining 3 members of the group were brothers, the Murphy brothers. The oldest involved in the crime was Michael Murphy. He was 33 years old at the time of Anita's murder. Michael had been sent to live with his grandmother when he was just 12 years old. His upbringing was unstable and his adult life was marked by crime. Then there was Gary Murphy, aged 28. Gary had struggled in school due to a hearing impairment. He eventually left school early and began working. Friends and acquaintances sometimes describe him as capable of steady employment, but he also had a very violent temper. And finally, the youngest of the three brothers, Les Murphy, aged 22. Les had already appeared before the Children's Court many times during his youth, mostly for theft-related offences. By adulthood, the Murphy brothers were deeply entrenched in criminal activity: car theft, burglary, and violence. Together with Travers and Murdoch, they formed a group responsible for more than 50 criminal convictions before Anita's murder even occurred. But none of those crimes compared to what happened on February 2nd, 1986. The trial began on March 16th, 1987 in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. The case immediately attracted enormous media attention. Reporters filled the courtroom. Newspapers ran daily coverage, and the Australian public followed every development. But before the trial could properly begin, something unexpected happened. John Travers changed his plea. He pleaded guilty. It was a shocking moment. The man believed to be the ringleader had admitted responsibility for the crime. But even with that admission, the trial still had to proceed for the remaining defendants. But very quickly, the process ran into a major problem. On the very day the trial began, a Sydney newspaper published the front page headline. The newspaper was The Sun, and the headline read,
"Anita murder, man guilty." Alongside the headline was a large photograph of John Travers.
The article also included damaging details about the criminal histories of the other men. For the defence lawyers, this was a serious issue, because jurors exposed to that kind of media coverage might be influenced before hearing the evidence. The judge agreed, and as a result, the jury was discharged. The trial had to restart with a completely new jury. But once the proceedings began again, the evidence presented in court would leave little doubt about what had happened. One of the most difficult moments of the trial came when the medical examiner described Anita's injuries. The report detailed extensive bruising across her body. Her head, face, shoulders, breasts, thighs and legs. The injuries were described as consistent with what the examiner called a systematic beating. There were also deep cuts across her body from the barbed wire fence that she had been dragged through. Cuts across her hips and legs. But the most devastating injuries were to her neck and hands. The knife wound to her throat had severed her windpipe. It nearly decapitated her. Her hands showed multiple cuts and defensive wounds. 3 fingers had nearly been severed. Injuries that likely occurred while she tried to protect herself from the knife. For many people in the courtroom, it was almost unbearable to hear. But the evidence was necessary, because it demonstrated the extreme brutality of the crime. The trial of the remaining defendants lasted 54 days, each piece of evidence adding to a grim picture of what happened on the night of the 2nd of February 1986. The prosecution had presented a clear argument. 5 men had abducted Anita Cobby. 5 men had taken her to a paddock near Prospect. And 5 men had participated in the assault that ended her life. The defence teams attempted a different strategy. Each lawyer tried to distance their client from the worst aspects of the crime. One argument suggested a defendant had not participated in the fatal attack. Another suggested a man had merely been present. But the evidence told a different story. The recorded conversations, the witness accounts, and the confessions. Ultimately, the jury agreed with the prosecution. On June 10, 1987, the jury delivered its decision. All 5 men were found guilty. Guilty of abduction, guilty of sexual assault, guilty of murder. For Anita's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but nothing could erase what had happened. The final stage of the trial now remained: sentencing. 6 days later, on June 16, 1987, the men returned to court. The judge presiding over the case was Alan Maxwell. By this stage, the full brutality of the crime had been examined in detail. And when Justice Maxwell spoke, his words reflected the gravity of what had occurred. He described the crime as one of the most horrifying physical and sexual assaults. He told the court the killing had been calculated, deliberate, and carried out in cold blood. And then he addressed the question of mercy. Justice Maxwell said,
"The executive should grant the same degree of mercy they bestowed on their victim."
It was a powerful statement, one that would be remembered for decades. The sentence was then delivered. All 5 men were sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. It was one of the harshest sentences available under the Australian law at the time. The murder of Anita Cobby left a deep scar on Australia. The brutality of the crime shocked the nation. But the story didn't end with sentencing. In the years that followed, Anita's family would transform their grief into action. Anita's parents, Gary and Grace Lynch, faced an unimaginable loss. But instead of retreating from the public eye, they chose to help others experiencing similar tragedies. Together with another grieving family, they helped create the Homicide Victims Support Group, a group that provides support to families affected by violent crimes, helping people navigate grief, the legal processes, and the emotional aftermath of homicide. For many families, it became a lifeline, a place to find people who understood what they were going through. The Lynches also became vocal advocates for tougher sentencing laws, campaigning for reforms to ensure serious offenders served longer sentences. Over the decades that followed, the men responsible for Anita's murder remained in prison. One of them eventually died behind bars. In February 2019, Michael Murphy died from cancer while in custody. He was 66 years old. The remaining offenders continue serving life sentences in maximum security prisons across New South Wales. Their exact locations are not publicly disclosed for security reasons, but the sentence remains the same: life imprisonment. Anita's father, Gary Lynch, died in 2008 at the age of 90. He had spent years advocating for victims' rights. Her mother, Grace Lynch, passed away in 2013. For decades, both had carried the memory of their daughter and the hope that some good could come from their loss. Today, Anita Cobby's name is remembered across Australia. Not just because of the crime, but because of the impact her story had on the country. Her murder changed conversations about sentencing. It changed conversations about victims' rights. And it led to support networks for families dealing with an unimaginable tragedy. But above all, Anita should be remembered for who she was: a daughter, a nurse, a friend, a woman described by those who knew her as compassionate, warm, and kind. Her life mattered, and her story continues to be told so that she is never forgotten. Thank you for listening to Coffee and Crime AU. If you found this episode informative, consider following the podcast and sharing it with others. And as always, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.